close your right eye. Just your right eye. Now look at something across the room with only your left. Notice how the edges are not quite as sharp as they used to be. You know this. You have known this for a while. Something changed after you turned 50, and you told yourself it was normal, just aging, just what happens. But you never asked why. You never asked what is physically happening inside that sphere sitting in your skull right now, and why the structure I spent 20 years dissecting and drawing is failing you in exactly the way I predicted it would 5 centuries before any doctor confirmed it. I cut open my first human eye in the winter of 1487. I was 35 years old, working by candlelight in the basement of the Santa Maria Nuova hospital in Florence. The monks let me use the bodies nobody claimed. I had already dissected hands and feet and arms. I had drawn muscles and tendons with a precision no one had attempted before. But the eye was different. The eye terrified me, not because of what it looked like inside, but because of what I realized it was. The camera obscura inside you. I had been experimenting with the camera obscura for years. A dark room with a small hole in one wall. Light enters through the hole and projects an inverted image of the outside world onto the opposite wall. I had written about this. I had drawn diagrams of it. And when I opened my first human eye and saw the structure inside, I understood immediately. Your eye is a camera obscura made of flesh. The cornea, the clear curved surface at the front of your eye, bends light inward. Behind it sits the iris, a ring of muscle that opens and closes to control how much light enters, exactly like the aperture in my camera. Behind the iris is the lens, a transparent disc made of a material unlike anything else in the human body. And behind the lens, coating the back wall of the sphere, is the retina, a living screen onto which the image of the world is projected upside down, reversed, just as it is in the camera obscura. Your brain flips it right side up. You have never once seen the world the way your eye actually receives it. I drew this. I drew the path of light through the eye in my notebooks, tracing how rays converge through the lens onto the retina. I drew it from multiple angles. I drew it in cross-section. I drew the refraction at each surface where light bends as it passes from one medium to another, from air to cornea, from cornea to aqueous fluid, from fluid to lens, from lens to the vitreous body that fills the main chamber. And I made a mistake that haunted me. In the camera obscura, the image on the back wall is inverted, upside down, reversed left to right. The physics demands it. Any time light passes through a small aperture or converges through a lens, the image flips. I knew this. I had demonstrated it many times. But I could not accept that we see the world upside down. I thought there must be a second inversion somewhere inside the eye, a correction built into the optics. I searched for it in every dissection. I never found it because it does not exist. The correction happens in the brain, not in the eye. The image on your retina right now, at this very moment, is upside down. Your visual cortex flips it. I was looking for an optical solution to a neurological problem, and I looked in the wrong place for years. but I was the first person in recorded history to correctly diagram the optical system of the human eye. And I noticed something in that very first dissection that would take anatomy 400 years to fully explain. The lens that cannot stop growing. When I dissected the eyes of older cadavers, the lens was different. In young bodies, the lens was soft, pliable, almost like clear jelly. I could press it between my fingers and it would flatten and spring back. In old bodies, the lens was hard, stiff, yellowed. I could not compress it the way I compressed the young lens. I drew both, I labeled the difference, and I wrote a note in the margin of my notebook that translates roughly to, "The lens of the old man has become like horn." Now here is what I did not know in 1489, but what physics and biology have since confirmed. Your lens never stops growing. From the moment you are born until the moment you die, your lens is adding layers. Not replacing layers, adding them. Like the rings of a tree trunk, new cells form on the outside and push older cells inward, compacting them. The oldest cells, the ones you were born with, are buried at the center of your lens right now, and they have been compressed and hardened for your entire life. This is the critical physics. Unlike almost every other cell in your body, the cells in the center of your lens have no blood supply. They have no nerves. They lost their nuclei, their mitochondria, their organelles during development. They are transparent precisely because they are empty. Clear bags of crystalline protein packed together with almost no internal structure to scatter light. And because they have no blood supply, they cannot be repaired. They cannot be replaced. They cannot be maintained. Every other tissue in your body is in a constant state of turnover. Your skin replaces itself every 2 to 3 weeks. Your red blood cells live about 120 days. Your bones remodel continuously. But the cells in the center of your lens are the same cells that were there when you were an infant. They are the oldest unchanged cells in your entire body. And they have been absorbing ultraviolet light and oxidative damage and chemical cross-linking for 50, 60, 70 years without a single repair. The cross-linking is the part I want you to understand. Crystalline proteins are arranged in precise geometric patterns inside each lens cell. This arrangement is what makes the lens transparent. Light passes through because the proteins are so evenly spaced that they do not scatter photons. But over decades, those proteins begin to bond to each other in ways they were never meant to. Glucose in your bloodstream reacts with the proteins through a process called glycation. Ultraviolet photons from sunlight break molecular bonds and create free radicals that attack neighboring proteins. The proteins clump. They aggregate. They form clusters large enough to scatter visible light. This is a cataract, not a disease, not an infection, not a failure of your immune system. A cataract is the inevitable physical consequence of a biological lens that cannot replace its own interior. If you live long enough, you will get one. Every human being who reaches 80 has some degree of lens opacity. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when. And the physics demands it because no protein structure exposed to decades of radiation and glycation can maintain perfect transparency indefinitely. I saw this cloudiness in the lenses I dissected. I described it. I drew it. I did not know the molecular mechanism, but I saw the result. The lens of an old man is not merely stiff, it is no longer fully clear. 500 years before the word cataract entered medical vocabulary in its modern usage, I was drawing the evidence. Why you cannot focus anymore. But the cloudiness is not what you notice first. The first thing you notice, and you noticed it somewhere around 42 to 48 years old, is that you cannot focus on things close to your face anymore. You hold your phone further away. You move the menu away from your eyes at the restaurant. You need reading glasses for the first time in your life. This is presbyopia, and it is caused by the same mechanism I just described, the same relentless growth and hardening of the lens. Here is the physics. To focus on something close, your eye must increase the curvature of the lens, make it rounder, thicker. This bends the light more sharply, so that the image of a nearby object converges precisely on your retina rather than behind it. A muscle called the ciliary muscle surrounds the lens in a ring. When it contracts, it releases tension on the fibers holding the lens in place, and the lens, if it is soft and elastic, springs into a rounder shape. When the muscle relaxes, the fibers pull taut, and the lens flattens for distance vision. This system works beautifully when the lens is young and soft. The muscle contracts, the lens reshapes. You can focus on something inches from your face. But as the lens adds layers and the center hardens, the lens becomes increasingly resistant to reshaping. The ciliary muscle still contracts. It does not weaken with age. The muscle is fine. But it is pulling on a lens that will not bend. It is like trying to reshape a rubber ball that has slowly turned to wood. The muscle works, the lens does not respond, and the focal point for near objects drifts behind the retina where your photoreceptors cannot reach it. I dissected the ciliary muscle in multiple cadavers. I drew the ring of tissue surrounding the lens. I noted how the fibers attached to the lens capsule. I could see that the mechanism was designed for adjustment, for a changing focal distance. What I could not understand in my time was why the mechanism failed with age. Now you know. The lens material itself defeats the muscle. The structure that was soft at birth becomes rigid through cumulative physical damage that no biological process can reverse. Because the cells at the core of the lens were cut off from the body's repair systems before you were old enough to remember. The retina is starving. But there is a second failure happening simultaneously, and this one is more dangerous. The retina, that living screen at the back of your eye where the image is projected, is one of the most metabolically demanding tissues in the human body. It consumes oxygen at a rate higher per gram than your brain. It needs this oxygen because converting light into electrical signals, the fundamental act of seeing, requires enormous energy. Every photon that strikes a photoreceptor triggers a cascade of chemical reactions that must be reset before the next photon arrives. And photons are arriving by the billions every second. The blood supply to the retina comes from two sources. The retinal vessels, which you can see when a doctor shines a light in your eye, and the choroidal vessels, a dense network of capillaries beneath the retina that supplies the outer layers, including the photoreceptors themselves, the rods and cones that actually detect light. After 50, these vessels change. The walls of the capillaries thicken. The basement membrane, a thin structural layer supporting the vessel wall, accumulates debris. Small deposits called drusen, pale yellow collections of lipid and protein waste, begin to form between the retina and the choroid. I could not see drusen with my naked eye during dissection. They are too small. But I could see something else. I noted that the tissue at the back of the eye in older cadavers appeared less vivid, less rich in color than in younger ones. I described the retinal surface as faded. I was seeing the macroscopic result of microscopic vascular deterioration. What is happening is this. The retinal pigment epithelium, a single layer of cells between the photoreceptors and the blood supply, is responsible for removing waste products from the photoreceptors and recycling the visual pigment molecules that make sight possible. These cells are among the hardest working in your body. Each pigment epithelial cell supports roughly 30 to 40 photoreceptors and must process millions of spent pigment molecules every day. Over decades, these cells accumulate a substance called lipofuscin. It is cellular garbage, molecular debris from incomplete recycling of visual pigment. Lipofuscin is fluorescent. It glows when you hit it with certain wavelengths of light, and it is toxic. It generates reactive oxygen species that damage the very cells trying to contain it. By age 80, lipofuscin can occupy more than 25% of the volume of a retinal pigment epithelial cell. A quarter of the cell is now garbage. When these cells fail, when they become so clogged with lipofuscin that they can no longer support their photoreceptors, the photoreceptors die. And photoreceptors in the human retina do not regenerate. You are born with roughly 120 million rods and 6 million cones. You will never make another one. Every photoreceptor you lose is gone permanently. This is age-related macular degeneration. The macula, the central region of your retina responsible for sharp, detailed vision, the part you are using right now to read this, degenerates because the support cells beneath it are drowning in their own waste. I want you to understand what this means in practical terms. The macula is tiny. It is roughly 5 millimeters across, about the size of a small pea. But it contains the highest density of cone photoreceptors in the entire retina. The very center of the macula, a pit called the fovea, is where your sharpest vision comes from. When you look directly at a face, a word, a traffic sign, you are aiming the fovea at it. Everything outside the fovea is progressively blurrier. You do not normally notice this because your eyes move constantly, sweeping the fovea across the scene, building up a detailed picture from many small, sharp glimpses. When the support cells beneath the fovea fail, the sharpest part of your vision goes first. The center of your visual field blurs or darkens. You can still see around the edges. The peripheral vision that comes from regions of the retina with lower metabolic demand and less waste accumulation. But the center, the point you aim at when you want to see something clearly, that is what you lose. People with advanced macular degeneration describe looking at a face and seeing everything except the face itself. The nose, the eyes, the mouth, all replaced by a smudge while the ears and hair remain visible at the edges. I dissected many eyes, and though I could not see the individual cells dying, I could see the result. The tissue at the center of the retina in old eyes was thinner, more fragile, more translucent than it should have been. I was seeing the aftermath of a process that takes decades to complete, and I drew it as faithfully as I could. The fluid that slowly clouds. There is yet another mechanism at work, the aqueous humor, the clear fluid that fills the front chamber of your eye between the cornea and the lens must be continuously produced and drained to maintain the correct pressure inside the eye. This pressure, called intraocular pressure, keeps the eyeball inflated to its proper shape. If the sphere deforms, the optics fail. The distance between lens and retina must remain precise. The drainage system for this fluid is a ring of tissue called the trabecular meshwork, located at the angle where the iris meets the cornea. It functions like a filter. Fluid passes through tiny channels in the meshwork and exits the eye into the bloodstream. After 50, this meshwork stiffens. The channels narrow. Cellular debris accumulates in the filter. Drainage slows. And if drainage slows enough, pressure inside the eye rises. This increased pressure pushes against the softest, most vulnerable structure at the back of the eye, the optic nerve head, the point where 1 million nerve fibers converge to exit the eye and carry visual information to your brain. These fibers are among the finest and most delicate axons in your nervous system. Sustained pressure damages them. They die from the periphery inward. Your peripheral vision narrows first. You do not notice because your brain compensates, fills in the missing edges with assumptions. By the time you notice, significant damage has been done. This is glaucoma, and I find it remarkable that the same basic physics applies. A drainage system that accumulates debris over time. A pressure that builds because outflow is restricted. A delicate structure that is crushed by the force of fluid it was never designed to withstand for this long. I drew the chambers of the eye. I drew the fluid pathways. I mapped the structures with an accuracy that anatomists would not match for 300 years. And in every old eye I opened, I could see that the structures at the front of the eye were less open, less clear, less obviously functional than in the young. I was seeing the trabecular meshwork in decline without knowing its name. Your eye is the most sophisticated optical instrument in the known world. It can detect a single photon. It can distinguish 10 million colors. It can adjust its focus from 6 inches to infinity in a fraction of a second. It tracks moving objects, compensates for head movement, and delivers a continuous stream of processed information to your brain through a nerve bundle carrying data at a rate that exceeds any fiber optic cable yet built by human engineers. And it fails because protein clumps in a lens that cannot clean itself, because waste accumulates in cells that cannot empty their garbage, because a filter mesh silts up and nobody designed a backflush. I dissected over 30 human bodies in my lifetime. I spent years drawing every structure I could find, mapping muscles and bones and organs with a precision driven by the belief that if I could see the design clearly enough, I could understand the designer's intent. And what I saw in the eye was the most elegant design and the most certain failure in the entire human body. Not because the design is bad, because the design is temporary. Every component is built to be extraordinary for a fixed period, and then the physics of accumulated damage overwhelms the biology. What you are looking through right now. Look at something again, anything. The room you are in, the surface in front of you, the light falling on whatever you are looking at right now. What you see is not the world. What you see is an image, projected upside down onto a living screen at the back of a fluid-filled sphere, captured by cells that are slowly dying and will never be replaced, focused through a lens that has been hardening since the day you were born, filtered through a fluid whose drainage system is narrowing year by year. And somehow, despite all of this, you can still see. The fact that you can read this at 50, at 60, at 70, is not because your eyes are working well. It is because they were built with such extraordinary precision that even in decline, even with a hardened lens and a thinning retina and a silting drainage system, the optics still function well enough to deliver an image your brain can interpret. That is not a failure of design. That is the margin of a design so good that it keeps working decades past the point any engineer would have predicted failure. The question you should be asking is not, why does my vision get worse after 50? The question is, how is it still working at all? I drew the eye by candlelight 500 years ago. I drew it because I wanted to understand how light becomes sight, how the physical world enters the mind through a small wet sphere made of water and protein and a thin film of living cells. And what I found is that the eye is not merely an organ, it is a lesson. The most beautiful machine you own is the one that is most quietly breaking down, and you will not appreciate what it gave you until the day the edges start to blur, and you realize that every sharp, clear image you ever saw was a gift from a structure that was already dying the entire time it worked. Hold something close to your face, a page, a hand, your own fingers. If you need glasses to see them clearly, you are feeling what I saw when I pressed the hard, yellowed lens of an old man between my fingers in a cold basement in Florence. The same physics, the same failure, the same beautiful temporary machine, doing its best with what remains. 500 years and nothing has changed. The lens still grows, the proteins still clump, the retina still starves, and the eye still works longer than it has any right to. That is the answer I found, not a cure, not a treatment, an understanding. That seeing clearly was never meant to last forever, and the fact that it lasted as long as it did is the most remarkable thing about you. I will tell you one more thing. I spent the last years of my life in France, at the Château du Clos-Luce, as a guest of the king. My right hand had been crippled by what was almost certainly a stroke. I could no longer paint with the precision that had defined my entire life. And my vision, the vision that had allowed me to see details in muscle and bone that no other anatomist had captured, was failing. The close focus was gone. The sharpness at the center was beginning to blur. I knew what was happening inside my own eyes, because I had seen it in every old body I had ever opened. I kept drawing. My last anatomical sketches are rougher than my earlier work. The lines are less certain. The details are softer. But they are still accurate, still correct, still the product of observation so careful that even a failing eye could capture what mattered. I drew until I could not see well enough to draw, and then I stopped. You are somewhere in that arc right now, somewhere between the perfect clarity you were born with and the blur that is coming. The lens is hardening, the retina is thinning, the drainage is slowing, and the light is still getting through. Not perfectly, not the way it used to, but enough. Enough to see the world, enough to read these words, enough to look at the face of someone you love and recognize them. That is the machine working past its designed lifespan. That is the margin of excellence I found inside a cold cadaver 500 years ago, and it is still inside you, right now, doing its quiet, extraordinary work in the dark behind your eyes.